talk about Shostakovich.
I am.
I'm gonna get really nerdy
One.
over
I
this.
gotta give you one note. Shostakovich.
Shostakovich.
I've been informed by my Russian-speaking betters that this is. I say it the same way that you do. I've been told.
If that really is the way you're supposed to say it, the reason that's not going to happen is because I learned his name Shostakovich over 10
So
years
did I.
over 10 years ago, like when I was in music school. So I can't, every professor I've ever had, every teacher, every time I've ever read the word in my head, I've always said Shostakovich. So Shostakovich is how I say it, and it's how I've always heard it said in the West. Oh, I did not know that. Is it really? How did you say it?
Shostakovich. Apparently, look. And apparently it's also Nabokov rather than Nabokov. But I don't speak Russian, so I don't know.
Neither do I. But I'll do my best. Anytime I ever do any foreign countries that don't speak English, I have this problem. But I suppose I feel a little bit bad about this because in some ways at the end I'm going to well, about this though I'm about to say, which is I'm going to probably compare myself to Shostakovich, and it's probably the height of hubris. But so joining me today, without further ado, is Tim's. I knew him as Tim's Darwin originally. I am the majority report for years, but he is known to his friends and enemies as Andrew Mathis, I guess. Hey, Andrew.
How you doing, Jeff?
I'm okay. And I brought Andrew on. Andrew knows a little bit about history of Europe, particularly the 20th century, surrounding World War II a little bit. I know a little bit about music, a little bit about history in general. We're going to talk about probably the most politically significant orchestral performance of all time. I can't think of another one. When you're in school, in music school, the big go-to performance that people usually bring up is Stravinsky's performance of the Rite of Spring in France. Before this, which
I was
is
literally just thinking of that.
Yeah, which is somewhat apocryphally has riots attributed to it. The crowd was very angry, damn near torn down the theater. I remember from my schooling that a lot of that stuff was pretty overblown. It didn't really happen quite that way. And this performance we're going to talk about today happened when there was literally a war going on right outside. And it was played by a bunch of like starving, besieged civilians. So I'm going to give it to Shostakovich instead of Stravinsky. Sorry, Stravinsky fans. Suck it. But in terms of Shostakovich, so who was Dmitri Shostakovich? People not hear this name, even though he's a world-class composer, just like Beethoven, Bach, Tchaikovsky, other names people don't even know anything about music probably recognize. Dmitri Shostakovich was born in 1906. He died in 1975, and he lived and worked basically his entire life within the Soviet Union, although it wasn't quite the Soviet Union when he was born, which means that he lived very interesting and precarious existence. He was always in trouble in some way with the authorities. Basically his entire life, although he did make it all the way to Brezhnev through Stalin, of course. So the purges never got to him, but they got pretty close more than once. Tim's or Andrew, if you prefer. I don't talk a lot about Soviet repression of the arts and letters during the Stalinist period specifically, but there was a lot of that, and some of it maybe you wouldn't shed a tear for, but a lot of it did go overboard, I would say. this is not a Stalinist podcast. I'm sorry. I have some affinity for Marxist Leninism, but I'm not exactly going to stand Stalin all day. And here is one of the smaller reasons why. Right? It's because of shit like this. Poor Shostakovich, who really was never a danger to anyone at any point. He couldn't live and work and write the way he wanted to, or even close to it, in the Soviet Union. So I don't know if you share my opinion on cultural censorship in the Soviet Union in the middle of its existence.
Well, certainly, I mean, there was a concerted effort by the Stalin regime in the late 1930s to suppress dissent in a way that was much more severe than it was before or after. But I think the main thing that happens during the 30s, 36 to 39, roughly, is that the people that are being targeted are all party people. There's no sort of like general repression of the population overall. It's really people within the Communist Party that are being targeted for elimination. And in that sense, I mean, the people that get caught up in that are really like somebody like although he actually doesn't die as a result of it. Maxim Gorky, the novelist, he dies right at as the great purges are beginning, and I think his son is actually targeted directly. But any of the writers that are actually targeted are targeted on the basis of their previous party activity and potential status as somebody that could oppose Stalin's rule. There's not a kind of like general move against like broadly culturally speaking against writers and artists that aren't politically affiliated.
I've debated going too much into the biography of Shostakovich. I'm going to skip over much of it because I mean he lived a really long time and a lot happened to him. But in terms of his censorship, what he was dinged for the audience and for you, Tim's, was something called an over adherence to formalism. What the fuck does that mean? Formalism as a thing, and formalism as I'm about to talk about it in terms of like what Stalin didn't like about Shostakovich are actually different. So I will just tell you that formalism in this particular case means that Stalin and other people like Stalin were concerned that Shostakovich made art for its own sake and with no eye, or at least not enough attention paid to the revolutionary character of art, or at least art should be revolutionary in character. It should depict the class struggle. It should have an eye towards workers' liberation, et cetera, et cetera. And if it doesn't have those things, and it is just a message to the world from an artist for its own sake, then that's formalism. That might not seem like formalism to you, and that's because it doesn't really make any sense. But Stalin wasn't a great musicologist. You may be surprised. He didn't actually write the denunciation or the serious criticisms in Pravda of Shostakovich's work, but there's good evidence that he basically told somebody else what to write, more or less. So that's how we get Shostakovich getting dinged for formalism.
And it kind of stands as like a counterpoint to during the Soviet period against socialist realism, right? I mean, it's socialist realism is the art that communicates the message. Formalism is the art, whether it's visual art or music or literature for that matter, that sort of stands on its own, like that doesn't convey the political message.
Yes, that's it. And I'm not saying you can't make good art or great art even under such an aesthetic philosophy, I suppose, but I don't know. Shostakovich is there really is just nothing harmful about his works, and it just is ridiculous and silly to repress the poor guy. To me, I don't really understand it. I don't think I ever will, but I've talked a little bit about the creator, so let's talk about the creation that we're gonna have played at this concert a little bit. So if people don't know, symphonies are numbered. They don't usually have titles. So people don't usually write things like I write a whole symphony and I title it, pastoral pastels or whatever the fuck, right? Sometimes in the new 20th, 21st century, people do this, but traditionally symphonies are just numbered. And we're talking about his seventh symphony, properly known Symphony Number 7 in C major, it's Opus 60, subtitled Leningrad. I was thinking a little bit right before this. I don't know, maybe this is a little silly and romantic of me. I think it's kind of sad that there is no city named Leningrad anymore. Not maybe there is, but not the one, right?
Right.
And I don't know, no shame against St. Petersburg, and I don't know, some people will probably accuse me of being a little too hard on Soviet communism. Other people will say I'm a little too easy on it. I'm not. Probably means I'm just right, or maybe it means I'm just wrong enough to be hated by everyone. I have no idea. Uh, but I don't think it was all bad, certainly, and I think in a lot of ways it wasn't so bad at all. It was quite good, and Leningrad being formerly and now currently St. Petersburg, if you don't know, is a bit tragic to me. But when he wrote the symphony, of course, the city was called Leningrad, and it is the city of Leningrad properly, and not St. Petersburg, that's about to be surrounded by a giant fucking army. So if you like, Tim's, we could talk a little bit about that giant fucking army. I guess two armies, right? It's one big giant
It's
fucking
actually
army.
like it's kind of like so it's like three armies, I guess. So and actually it's part of the larger. This is the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union begins in June of 1941, and it's the biggest, still is the biggest military invasion in history, and they send in three full armies as a way of attacking. And one of the northernmost drive of the German army is through the Baltic states towards St. Petersburg, toward what is then Leningrad. And in that offensive, they are accompanied by the Finnish army, which is not an ally of Germany, but they've sort of fought for the title of co-belligerent. And then there's also units of the Italian army. And then finally, there are volunteer units from Spain that have been incorporated into the German army called the Blue Division, and they all descend upon Leningrad. The Finnish army from the north, and the rest of them from the other directions.
Those Blue Division guys will be popping up later towards the end of this episode. And I wanted to say about them because I looked into this and I was somewhat surprised. So I'll tell you, audience. Spanish volunteers, you might be thinking it's not that many, maybe a few hundred guys. It wasn't like a giant army, but we are talking thousands and thousands of soldiers from Spain. Now, so not just a few smatterings here and there. They were definitely big enough that they were cohesive and large enough a strategic unit to have their own command, right? And so they're all put together. They're not sprinkled here and there. So yeah, we have got them, and we've got the Finns basically on the north. We don't want to get too deep into it, but just to like settle sort of your geography, audience. St. Petersburg, before something called the Winter War, which happened a little bit before this, it lies just about a couple dozen miles, I'd say, from the Finnish border at the time. Now, obviously, when Finland is a possession of the Tsar, when St. Petersburg is founded by Peter the Great, hundreds of years before that, that's not a big deal because Finland is just your backyard. But now that Finland is its own country post the Bolshevik Revolution, which we don't have time to get into all of that, it is becomes very nervous. The leadership of the Soviet Union, that is, with St. Petersburg right there on the order, and so for reasons of border security, among others, there is a war fought for territorial expansion by the Soviets into the lands that become Finland a little bit. Another thing about St. Petersburg or Leningrad, as people should know at this time, is that the Soviet Union, because it's primarily composed of Russia, is incredibly poor. And by poor, I don't just mean like they open their wallet and like a little fly comes out, right? I know by poor I mean like more in a Marxist sense, is like the forces of capital accumulation have yet to really accelerate there. In other words, they have yet to really industrialize thoroughly. And St. Petersburg by itself is about 11% of the entire nation's industrial output. There just aren't that many factories. There just isn't that much electricity, et cetera, to do stuff like that. You know, the vast majority of the population is still engaged in agriculture, and the vast majority of that just for subsistence. And it is this country that the Germans are about to try to roll up the western half of, at least, by sending a massive invasion force to Leningrad with the help of the Finns, who are, I don't want to hold them blameless because there's going to be a lot of death and destruction that we're going to talk about in Leningrad. And they did participate in that, in encircling the city. But they were most interested in just recapturing land that had been seized by the Soviets in the previous war, I'd say. Would you say that's fair, Tim's? I don't. Maybe it's not.
No, I would definitely say that's the case. I don't think that there was. It's one of the reasons why the Finns really sort of fought for this status as a co-belligerent rather than as an ally. The thing to remember about the Nazis invading the Soviet Union is this is not just a like a war of conquest, although it is that. It's like they call it a war of extermination. The idea is to eradicate the Soviet Union utterly and entirely so that it doesn't exist as a country anymore. And Finland's not interested in that. Finland is interested in reclaiming its territory. They're not crazy about the fact that they have a large communist country to their east, but provided that they can maintain their territorial integrity, they're not really worried about like getting rid of communism in Europe or anything like that. Their goal is just the territory thing, and they actually, to their benefit, to give them a little bit of slack. I mean, they don't particularly agree with the way things are done there, and they will vocally take issue with it and not participate in some of the more egregious things that Germany does. They understand the need to take the city, but they're not interested in doing things with regard to the population, the civilian population.
Yeah, and in terms of the plans for the city, which was more or less to just level it to the ground, like Roman salting the earth style, they weren't interested so much in that. And the history is a little bit more complicated because after World War II, flash forward, a generation, Finland and the Soviet Union actually have fairly good relations, and everyone has every interest in keeping things that way. And so there's just not a whole lot of interest on either side in diving into the Finnish army's participation in Leningrad and any evil they might have done. Not that it never happened or whatever, but history is a political project like anything else is that humans make. And so, like, the post-war conditions after this terrible siege we're about to talk about, I would say they also contribute to that. But that isn't to say that our main villains here, such as we have, are not the Finns. It's not the Finnish military. No, it's Nazis. Nazis, fam. Nobody likes them. They're bad. So let's talk a little bit about that city where the orchestral performance is about to happen. I give you a few facts about it, but basically the bottom line is this: in the September of 1942, the Wehrmacht cut the last road into the city, and after that, for about 900 days, more or less, the city was cut off from reliable supply. They could get some things that were lifted in. There was late in the war, they opened up one corridor that was just a few miles wide that they could get things in. And when the lake was frozen to their backs, basically, if Leningrad's facing west, when it was frozen over and you could brave the bombardment and planes that might shoot and bomb at you as you tried to run the blockade, you could get some supplies in that way. But all this is pretty dicey. It's not true throughout the entire siege, so there will be huge swaths of time where you basically can't get anything, and you are a prisoner inside of Leningrad if you live there. Which, by the way, is a city of, I think before this started, over 2 million people, right? Something
Yeah,
like that.
it's the second biggest city in the country after Moscow.
And there will be less than 1 million inside it at the end of this. Not all of those people will die. A lot of them will flee and then die. Some of them will flee and then live. And a lot of people inside the city are going to die. So for about 900 days, you got the Germans basically on the south side, and you got the Finns a little bit on the north side. The German army, of course, has those crack Spanish volunteers who are just so excited about Hitler they couldn't wait to join up. Casualties, 1.5 million soldiers and civilians died just on the Soviet side. 1.5 million. It's absolutely one of the bloodiest episodes of history of all time, if not the bloodiest, maybe. And hundreds of thousands of more civilians died during attempted evacuations. So how did they die? Well, they died, kind of the old-fashioned ways people die when there's a city siege. City sieges have been happening for a long, long time. One thing that I think is always interesting to point out is at the beginning of the siege, money becomes worthless, which is always fun to think about, right? And I like to start with something like this because this is a real nice way of like grounding yourself. Think about your life today. Even if it wasn't quite so capitalist, we need a means of exchange. Most people would probably say, and if you need something, generally speaking, you go to the store, you buy it, right? You need something, the money is how you get it. And this is something that we've literally lived your entire life. This is always true. Well, very suddenly, it's not true. And you may as well be wiping your ass with that paper. I don't know. I think that's interesting myself.
Yeah, it's weird. It's there's this economic principle where uh, it's called Gresham's law. It's the idea bad money pushes out good. You have worthless currency circulating. People will hoard what they have, and they'll trade the bad currency. But I guess that that assumes a normal situation when you have an absolute stoppage of resources coming in. Then people will only trade, I guess, with other resources rather than worrying about what money can buy or not.
I mean, because
Most people,
closed economies are like there's something that humans have experience with, I'd say, but like only in the very distant past when we
yeah,
didn't have like transportation options and shit like that. And so, like, if you were an isolated people, either by geography or language or whatever, like your economy could be closed, but it's been just like so long since anyone had to live that way that the idea of a city, not just all the material goods coming in, but also like, financing is not circulating in any way. Like banks are totally just worthless buildings now, all that becomes true. And you become a sort of like communal society by necessity and in a sort of like primitive sense because, there's just only so much food. So food is immediately rationed. This ration doesn't start this low, but it goes as low as 125 grams of bread a day, about half of which is sawdust in 1941. If anyone's interested, look up how much 125 grams is and see if you imagine living on that for a day. Amazing. If you were a worker, you got double that. And if you were a soldier, you got a little bit more than that too. But also, all the pets and zoo animals got eaten. There'll be a tragic story of a cat later. And I didn't know this, but the wallpaper at the time, especially in Leningrad, you commonly made it from potato starches, and that was the primary ingredient. And people stripped their houses of wallpaper, put it all in a pot, and boiled it into soup. They were so hungry. They also probably ate each other at least a very, very, very little bit. This probably only happened like a few times, but and it was more of a thing to threaten somebody with. It became like a kind of cultural thing. If the authorities caught you misbehaving or disobeying rations, curfew, whatever, they might threaten to eat you, throw you into a pot or something. And these were, not funny threats at the time when everyone's like starving. I know that's pretty gruesome to think about, so we don't just dwell on it, I guess. Except I know Tim Darwin has a craving for human flesh, but only if that human flesh's net worth is above, like, I don't know, $500 million.
Exactly. Only when we actually eat the rich, and then it can be considered a delicacy, but otherwise.
So basically, all of society grinds to a halt. Nobody goes to work because nearly all industry is shut down. There's no fuel. They run out of coal very quickly. They try to chop trees, but that's never going to work. There are no horses to ride, certainly. And because there's no fuel, if you have a car, if you're rich enough to have a car, those are useless. So the fastest way to get around is actually bicycle. I don't know if it's bicycles or whatever, but the thing about bicycles is they take physical effort, caloric energy to power, and caloric energy is suddenly at a premium, which meant that a lot of people had a way to get around, which meant that 125 grams of bread a day that was put out by person at different like kiosks and stations throughout the city. If your walk was just a few blocks and you were too hungry and sick to make it that far, you would die within just not that far of food. And a lot of people would die on the way to get food. And it became common to see in the alleyways and streets just bodies lying there, half dead or dead, people who just decided to die, to give up. And it's terrible. Also, German planes and artillery destroyed about 16% of the city's housing, but don't fret, because everyone's dying, so everyone's house is empty. So if your house is destroyed, you could just move into your dead neighbors, and you're good. Before we move on from all the ways Leningrad was terrible, that's about all I have, Tim. So I don't know if you have anything you want to add about how great it is to live inside a siege that lasts almost 3 years.
Yeah, no, I think we pretty much covered it.
No rat problem in Leningrad at the time either. I'll say that. So. That's gruesome stuff. Let's talk about something more cheery. The people of Leningrad certainly wanted to, and they actually ended up working very hard to find something cheery, or at least different to talk about. And that, like I said, was Dmitri Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, and their orchestral performance thereof. Now, I don't want to get too music appreciation on anyone or too philosophy of music or anything like that, but music is not notes on a page whose durations and pitch is marked and who has playing directions in Italian. That's not really music, although we say, hand me that music, and that's what we mean. And it's also more than just a produced recording of sound. Music is not just the existence of sound in one place at one time as captured by a listening device, either the human ear or a microphone. Every performance of a piece of music, whether it's written down in somebody's head or it's written down on a paper, whether it's 3 minutes long or it's about 88 minutes long, like Shostakovich's 7th Symphony, which is quite long for a symphony, in case people are wondering. It's a new creation every time. And so we're not going to talk about Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7 in terms of its form and development, what you can appreciate it and what not, whether it falls into the neoclassical tradition of Stravinsky or something else, or borrows more from Rimsky-Korsakov, all that crap that I probably would have spent pages and pages writing about years ago when I wasn't busy drinking beer, chasing girls, right? I'm not going to do any of that. We're just going to talk about the one performance. And this performance was the idea of the Soviet military itself. And they went to a great trouble to put it on in August of 1942, which is about halfway through the siege. Or maybe a third, good way through, right?
Yeah.
So I'll tell you about that symphony. First of all, it's a pain in the ass. Is what we'd call it in the classical music world. It's pain in the ass, technical term. Like I said, it's long and it takes about 100 people to play. Your average orchestra is not anywhere near 100 people, maybe half that number. Leningrad, millions of people in it, right? And lots of orchestras too. Lots of really, really, really good ones with players who probably could play Shostakovich, but all of them had been evacuated. Womp womp. Except one, the worst one, I'd say, the Leningrad Radio Orchestra. They were the only ones left in the city. They broadcasted for the last time before the premiere at January 1942. They only had about 40 guys. And of course, most of those are going to be like violins, violas, cellos, and stuff, not on horns or percussion or anything like that. One of the fun stories about this performance that shows you just how important it was really to them at a basic level. They were literally pulling guys off the front to come do this. They found guys who had old instruments that were not maintained, and these people really didn't have much of a musical education at all. But if you could play an instrument, you could halfway read music. Then depending on what that instrument played, like, congratulations, you don't have to live in this trench anymore. You get to come back to the city. You get triple rations, and as inglorious as, I suppose, how many grams of bread would that be? 375 grams of bread a day. It might not seem luxurious to you, but like when you're starving, that's pretty awesome, I'd say, right? So the conductor of that orchestra, Carl Leisberg, is himself sick, nearly dead, and he had to go door to door to Leningrad to find any musicians who hadn't responded to these. They literally like put out calls over the loudspeakers of the city and posters plastered everywhere. If you're a member of the orchestra, come to work. The people he found that weren't dead were incredibly bedraggled and thin, and of course, very out of practice. That cat that I was telling people about before, the oboe broke. And the thing about musicians is, I've never met one who knew how to really fix their own instrument. I don't know why this is. We're all really bad at maintenance, like all of us. Or maybe that's just me. But we always go to somebody else to fix our instruments for us. And he went to the only guy in the city who knew how to fix an oboe that he knew was alive. And he asked him, "How can you fix my oboe? I can't pay you, not because I don't have any money, but because money doesn't do anything." And the guy had already eaten several house cats, so he asked for another one, and so he got one. Yum. It's very, very sad. This is the trouble they went to fix that goddamn oboe. In fact, rehearsals for Shostakovich's Symphony No. 7 are directly responsible for the deaths of at least 3 people. like literally 3 people dropped dead from exhaustion practicing for this. Now, maybe they would have died anyway, right? But I think that's a good way to think about it. They were literally killing themselves to do this. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So once you've got 100 people who can maybe try to play Shostakovich Symphony Number 7, you also got to find a way to put on a premiere successfully, because if I haven't made things clear yet, there's a German army outside, and that German army's got they got planes and shit. They got planes, they got artillery. You know, it's not just a bunch of like infantry standing around in a World War I style trench warfare, just like taking pot shots at the other side. I mean, this is real industrial warfare, and there are real. There's a lot of destruction. It's not just a bunch of. It's not just a good old fashioned siege. The city's still being bombarded. Because the city's being bombarded, you have to find a way to like keep that bombard from interrupting your orchestral performance. And the way the Soviets went about this was they started a secret military operation called Operation Squall. It just wasn't too sophisticated, but basically what they did was they found out where the German artillery positions were a few weeks in advance through intelligence. I'm not sure exactly how. I think I read somewhere once that they may have used balloons or something, but I could have made that up. I don't know. Do you know how they found the German artillery positions? Maybe not.
No, no, I don't. I mean, there
Um,
were a lot of spies on both sides, so anything is possible.
I think probably it was just human intelligence that did this, which kind of makes it even more amazing to imagine like risking your life for this information, and then like you're about to see what they do with it. So they know where the artillery positions are weeks in advance. So they haven't fired on them yet, and they waited until the night of the premiere in August of 1942 to do so, because they wanted to surprise the Germans and silence those batteries effectively for an hour, and they really only had one shot to do that. And I was just wondering, like, in between those artillery positions being destroyed or suppressed with enemy fire, and after their discovery, but before that repression, I wonder how many people they killed. I mean, there's no way to know, right? But everyone who died during that time, they died so the Leningrad Radio Orchestra could play Shostakovich's Symphony Number 7. The score itself to Symphony Number 7, which had been completed a few months before, and this is not the world premiere of the symphony. The score had been smuggled out and had already been premiered a couple times, but this was the first time Leningrad was going to hear it. It had to be airlifted in along with other like vital medical supplies, and it had to be copied into parts by hand, mostly by the performers themselves, which is like it's man, like it's like if you have bad handwriting, like you have bad handwriting, Andrew. I have bad handwriting.
Yeah, I have horrendous handwriting.
So just like when I write words just with my hands, it's bad. Okay. Musical notation is way more complicated than English, I would say, in some ways. And in terms of like the hand movements necessary to like draw them out neatly in a way that you could read from distance and play accurately, it's actually a huge pain in the ass. I can't imagine doing it when I'm like shaking from starvation. It would suck ass. There's a story about one performer being late to the orchestra, which was basically turned into a military operation. His wife died, and he didn't even skip rehearsal. Tim's. He didn't even skip. He was just late. You know, he took a little extra time to just bury his wife, and he got his rations cut in front of the whole orchestra by Eliasberg, who was a huge hard ass on this shit. It's terrible. The last thing they did was they broadcast the performance via loudspeaker. This is something I wanted to ask you about because I didn't know this. I read a little like fact. So like right when the war started in the Soviet Union, because it was so poor, anyone who had a radio, the government came to your door and was like, "Nice radio. Thank you for giving it to us. Goodbye."
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, like like you said, when we were talking about the level of development in the Soviet Union, it was low, and the things like radios were things basically that people only in the cities had. But the main thing to remember is that considering how rural Russia was, most people weren't in cities, and most of the fighting therefore didn't take place in cities. So you needed those radios, and yeah, they were requisitioned like anything else that could be useful to the war effort. In fact, just one thing that I wanted to that I thought of before when you were talking about the level of development and how low it was. In those areas of the Soviet Union where there was sufficient time to evacuate while the Nazis were coming in, they actually dismantled entire factories and moved them because there was nothing that could
Yeah,
do industrial
it was
production
worth
in
it
the
to
areas
him.
that were.
And yeah,
Sorry?
it was worth it to him. Like you just think about what a huge logistical and physical like pain in the ass that would be to like move a factory, like the
Exactly.
whole thing. But
Yeah.
but you would do it
Yeah.
if like you couldn't get a factory any other way, maybe, right? Like
Well, exactly. Yeah. So these factories in Ukraine and Belarus in particular, they get moved into the Russian interior because there's enough time to do it. Like in Eastern Poland, where there's also factories and stuff like that, there's no time at all. So they get taken over or they get destroyed.
so because like nobody has a radio, um, a personal radio, and they've all been requisitioned to the military. It doesn't mean like the radio wasn't still going. And in fact, they were always broadcasting, even if they were just broadcasting like bullshit, or at least they tried to. Um, the performance was broadcast via uh, speaker throughout the entire city, including blasted out like towards the front line to the German soldiers who were in the trenches surrounding the city. Now there's some like really heartwarming. There's like a heartwarming story of Eliasberg after the war, like speaking to some German soldiers who had been at Leningrad and allegedly reporting that they had been like, "Wow, we should have just given up now. The people inside are too awesome and brave. Look at them playing this orchestra." And I gotta say, like, I'm not saying I don't believe it, Tim's, but it strikes me as a little just so. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know if you share my skepticism on that, especially considering like what actually happens once the symphony is performed, which we'll get to. But that this I don't know, this smacks of revisionism to me. Not I'm not saying it didn't happen for sure, but the story is just a little too perfect. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, you can imagine, maybe individual cases where people are, they draw great inspiration from the moment, but like that
Right.
it's in some way decisive to the outcome.
Yeah, as
Is a
if
bit
there's like
far-fetched.
whole divisions who are just like, they got their rifles trained up, and then suddenly like they slump a little bit, like, oh my god, what are we
Yeah.
doing?
Exactly.
It's nothing like that, I don't think. But it did
Yeah.
affect the German soldiers more than the German soldiers, though. It was really for the population. To make this clear, and Eliasberg, I think, made it clear when he opened the performance with this, which was, of course, broadcast live to the city, live to the front, and to the soldiers. The reason the Soviets have confiscated all the radios is so they could like distribute them to like the military. And so like the Soviet military out there, like they do have some radios, and they are encouraged to tune in, and so they all do. And when they do, they are greeted by the voice of Eliasberg, who says in Russian, quote, "Comrades, a great occurrence in the cultural history of our city is about to take place. In a few minutes, you will hear for the first time the Seventh Symphony of Dmitri Shostakovich, our outstanding fellow citizen. He wrote this great composition in the city during the days when the enemy was insanely trying to enter Leningrad. When the fascist swine were bombing and shelling all Europe, and Europe believed the days of Leningrad were over. But this performance is witness to our spirit, courage, and readiness to fight. Listen, comrades," end quote. That's not my translation. It's a little clunky. Tense is a little bit wrong, but something like that. And so they were off to the races. And I gotta tell you, Tim's, the performance was bad. It was very bad. Of course it was bad. They were starving and half of them were amateurs. And you know, I don't want to be too hoity-toity with you. It's tough to play any symphonic work at a professional level well. Even the classics like Mozart, Beethoven. Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony is not particularly accessible. And it's very tricky to play. Don't get me wrong, it's a fine symphony, and I like it very much, but it's on the tougher side of pieces to tackle for sure. And this orchestra was crap. In fact, they only played through the whole thing successfully one time before the actual broadcast of playing it through the whole way through. And so they almost fell apart. Literally, the orchestra, enough people lost their places and stopped playing that they were in danger of having to stop and start again. The audience in the house was packed, apparently, because if you're not a soldier at the front, there's nothing to do. So this is all that's going on. They rose from their seats in mid-performance in a sort of spontaneous gesture. Normally, this might seem like a big deal to anyone, but making any noise or especially standing up and moving around during a performance of a symphony it's rude. It's beyond rude. Like literally, I don't even know how you would describe it. You may as well go up and punch the conductor in the face. Unless there's an emergency, of course. But I'm not talking like my kid's crying, I gotta go. Like that kind of thing. If it's happening, you leave the kid outside because you don't interrupt a performance like this. Never. You would never ever do anything like stand up or make any noise whatsoever. You'd be highly discouraged to do this. But they did it, and they had to, because if they hadn't, the orchestra might have given up playing Shostakovich's Symphony 7. I read something that stuck in my craw a little bit, Tim's. I don't know if you think a lot about what makes art or music good, or what being good actually means. But the phrase that I read that irked me was the performance was of poor artistic quality.
Yeah.
This is incorrect. The performance was of
Well,
poor
is it
professional quality. Go ahead.
exactly? I mean, this is exactly the point I was going to make. Was it a judgment of the ability of the musicians to play their instruments, or is it a judgment of the symphony itself and how Shostakovich wrote it, and therefore how is it as a piece of art? I mean, it seems like a poor choice of words, if nothing else.
I mean, it is true. Like they played badly, but there is more to art than playing professionally. And sometimes, if your circumstances are particular enough, as these were, I'd say, it can matter almost not at all how good you are. In fact, if you could just get through the thing, then that's literally good enough to make amazing art, which this was. This was a performance of the highest artistic quality, not because they played particularly well, but partly because of the old saw, through adversity you make great art, something like this, right?
Yeah.
Now you can't. You can't make your own adversity and have it count, in my opinion. But this was organic, certainly. It had nothing to do with the orchestra. Certainly didn't plan any of this. And in terms of like ranking Shostakovich's Symphony Number 7, not just at the time, but today too, this is still kind of true. It's not really regarded as one of humanity's finest symphonies. Beethoven's Fifth and Ninth usually get People like those a lot. People like Tchaikovsky. People like Mozart. Uh, some weirdos even like Bach still. No, I'm kidding. Bach's fine. Although Bach wrote no symphonies, but me too. But Bach wrote no symphonies, of course. Classical art music. Shostakovich's Symphony Number 7 is not among those. In fact, Shostakovich's Symphony Number 7 is not even among his best symphonies, most people consider. And in fact, Shostakovich's symphonies are not really even his best stuff. His better stuff is in his string quartets and stuff. The stuff that the Soviets, basically would never let him perform, and so he kept in a drawer his whole life until we found him later. But all that said, in this moment at least, it is his greatest work of art, I'd say. And there are some questions in Symphony Number 7 about exactly who he has in mind when he's writing a lot of the dark and foreboding and dissonant and weird stuff in there, whether he's thinking about an invading German army or not. It turns out he's actually, when he writes that stuff, he's thinking about the Bolsheviks under Stalin, that's who he's thinking about when he's writing a menacing invasion theme. And it's only kind of after the fact that all becomes about Germany, and some of the mythos around this as an anti-fascist symphony begins to form. But all that said, in this moment, none of that mattered. There was just the music that was playing, just barely, by a pack of just the most pathetic and pitiful musicians you've ever seen for a city that's full of people who are a little better off. And I'm not sure exactly what art is or how it should be defined. There's a lot of different ways to go about it, but if it's some sort of aesthetic message designed to evoke a human response, then the performance was probably more successful than any other in the entire history of mankind, which is a pretty big deal, I'd say. Did you read my outline?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I wanted to quiz you. I was hoping you'd say no.
Oh.
So how long was the standing ovation?
Standing ovation was an hour long.
Yeah, over an hour. Almost. The symphony only takes 88 minutes. Man, I was hoping to surprise you with that. Well, thanks for ruining the podcast. I'm just kidding.
I told you I read the outline.
I know you did, man.
You thought I was bullshit.
No, some other guests I have, they don't ever read anything I write.
Not naming any names.
No, I'm not. So all that out of the way, what was the point of this? And I want to tell everyone really a sad story. No, it's not too sad, because of course Leningrad, though, well, let's stop for a second, actually. Let's not talk about the point. Let's, because we said this a little bit, but I want to hit it, and I know you have some things to say about this. I think the Finns don't really have any plans for Leningrad beyond we just want some of our territory back, please. But the Germans absolutely do have plans for Leningrad, and I've kind of brushed over it before when I said, wipe the whole thing out. But we should talk a little bit more about what that would mean and what they were going to do, right?
Yeah. So what's happening at Leningrad is kind of like it's emblematic of the larger campaign and plan of what Germany's trying to do in the Soviet Union, which I mentioned a while back. It's not just a war over territory. The idea is to completely demolish the Soviet Union, eradicate communism in Europe by taking out the Soviet government. But more importantly, in the longer term, Germany's operating under this thing called General Plan East, and the idea is that they are going to eliminate an enormous proportion of the population of the Soviet Union, either through starvation or through mass deportation, or even just through mass murder. But the idea is that maybe 10% of the population of the Soviet Union will remain to the west of the Ural Mountains, and they'll be like a servant class to a new generation of German farmers and industrialists who will take up residence in the quote unquote liberated areas of the Soviet Union. So what they're doing is kind of like what they're doing in Leningrad is kind of a microcosm of what they intend to do for the entire country. So it serves as a kind of object lesson for what could possibly happen if the city were to fall. It becomes highly symbolic, I think, for that reason.
I mean, I've heard it put this way, and I like it. It's their plan was more or less feudalism with machine guns.
Yeah,
like
it's well put.
These you would have like a incredibly hierarchical class-based society, and you'd have what remains of the Soviet population, which was not going to be very much, because Hitler was explicit about he was going to expend literally zero resources on keeping these people alive, even to use them as like a labor force. What would be left over would be more or less just like what happened to be left over, whatever that was. And they were gonna after they duly rewarded the Finns with some territory of their own for their cooperation in the operation. Yeah, the vast majority of the land around Leningrad was just going to be kind of like feudal estates. In other words, there'd still be some industry, right? They weren't looking to go backwards in terms of the mode of production. But the reason I described it as like feudalism with machine guns is because that they really were like going to just put these people to work in agriculture in a large part, because like that was cheap. That's what they could do with them.
Yeah,
And they weren't planning on paying them a wage. You know what I mean?
no, and not for nothing. I mean, importantly, where St. Petersburg and Leningrad is part of where there had been for hundreds of years. There had been a long established German-speaking landed gentry holding large estates where the peasants were largely of the ethnic minorities that lived in those areas. So Estonians and Latvians, Lithuanians, and Russians in the estates that are closer up to the area near Finland. So from the standpoint of Germany, they're just going to be reconstituting what had been there in the past, just better than it was before.
Yeah, well, good thing they did it.
Yeah.
Because the word genocide gets thrown around a little bit regarding this siege. From what I've read, it seems fair enough to me, I'd say, to call these ambitions, and indeed some of what they did on the German side, genocidal. Would you?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that this is an act of genocide, and that the intentions, certainly of Germany in the long term, are just complete cultural eradication. And another thing to sort of bear in mind against all of this is that one of the things that Germany up until this point has been doing for the first well, really for the entire war against the Soviet Union, is they're taking millions of prisoners of war from the Red Army, and they're just not feeding them at all. They're just putting them behind barbed wire and letting them starve. And then 2.5 million of them die that way. That doesn't include the ones that are killed in battle or shot after being taken POWs. These are just like 2.5 million, enlisted men in the Red Army who are just put behind barbed wire with nothing.
They were absolutely planning on doing the same with the civilian population of Leningrad, the ones they didn't, just murder, right? Like,
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
it really was like it's that simple and brutal. We have these people. We're not gonna feed them, and we're not gonna bother with any of that. And and if they act up, we'll shoot them, and that's it.
Exactly.
The reason I bring that up is because I don't know if people have, because I sort of had this sense, if not like explicit understanding of genocide when I think of it, because when I think of it, to be blunt, the first example that always comes to mind is the Holocaust, is
Right.
the extermination of the Jewish people in Europe. Of course, this genocide is largely, you could describe it in terms of religion, but it's really more of an ethnic cleansing. and a lot of genocides that people think about in the modern era, I would say they also have an ethnic sort of framework to them. Not that like the Germans weren't racist or xenophobic against the peoples of Leningrad and Eastern Europe, but this was kind of more than just singling out an ethnic group. It really was about, you know, a whole slew of ethnic groups, I suppose, right?
Yeah, I
And
mean, they really
killing
did
them
kind
all.
of view right. I mean, they really did kind of view the unwashed masses of the European East as being, you know, of just poor, you know, human material, poor quality human beings that
Is this
obviously would be better off being replaced by Germans.
is this a is this a result of like the virulent anti-Semitism that has been cultivated not just by the Nazis but in German society for many decades? When it got so virulent that, you know, Hitler comes to power and builds concentration camps, is this also sort of like an evolution of that phenomenon in some way? Do you think where like this sort of training in people's minds to be so xenophobic and hostile and violently repressive towards the other has like bled into a new thing and is infecting the way they think about other populations that aren't Semitic?
Yeah,
Do you think
yeah,
that's how it works?
absolutely. Absolutely, and I actually think that to a very large extent, you can actually include the anti-Semitism within that larger phenomenon among the German population, not among the Nazis. For the Nazis themselves, anti-Semitism is special, right? It plays a central role. Jews are not just a racial enemy; they're like a racial, almost like anti-force against all of humanity, right? So they're thinking about anti-Semitism as absolutely cosmic in a way, and you know, so it informs why they do the things they do in a way that for the general population in Germany, it doesn't. Like the Nazis really can't play anti-Semitism as a big issue for them the first, you know, 5 or 6 years of the regime because it's just not. It doesn't reverberate with the general population in Germany. Germany has it's about 1 million Jews before when the Nazis take power, and they're very well integrated. And most people that
Right.
live in the city know Jewish people. The year before the Nazis take power, more Jewish people marry non-Jews than marry Jews that year. That among the Jewish people that actually get married. So for them, for the German population at large, I mean, clearly there are obviously some real anti-Semites in that population as well. But by and large, for the German population, it's a combination of relentless propagandizing on the part of the government about the Jews, but at the same time, and more important to what we're talking about here, the elevation of the German people in that same propaganda, so that everybody's inferior to them.
I mean, it occurs to me that you know, not to be too personal, but like the reason that you are here in like not in Europe, for example, is because long before there was any Hitler, your ancestors who were German Jews came to this country, but because Germany had such a what has a long history of anti-Semitism in its society. Like that's just to make the point that like uh, Hitler did not invent and the Nazis
No,
did not invent hating Jews as a political project or anything like that, right? Like
no,
that.
they didn't, but they also they did things with it that previous generations hadn't done. That's an
Yes.
important distinction.
No, absolutely they're both a product of the acceleration of those forces and an acceleration of those forces themselves
Yeah,
and how they
absolutely,
behave.
absolutely.
Um
Yeah, I mean,
so
my ancestors in
oh
the
good.
1830s and 40s. You know, I mean, and there was, you know, there was always sporadic outbursts of Europe. You could pretty much, you know, set your clock by it. I mean, it was worse in Eastern Europe where my wife's family comes from, and it lasted a
And
hell of a
that's
lot
why
longer.
like there were not that many Jews in Germany like at the time of the Nazi ascension, right? Like there were some, but not it wasn't like the place was crawling, especially because like, you know, Kristallnacht happens and I don't want to get
Right,
too far
right.
afield, but like, you know, people have been
By the
fleeing
time,
for a long time.
yeah, by the time the war starts, so that's 6 years into the Nazi regime. About 80% of the German Jewish population has emigrated by that point. It's gone someplace else, just because they see that there's no future else there.
Yeah, go figure. So all that is to kind of set up what happens after this symphonic performance. Literally just a few days after the premiere of Leningrad, the symphony, the Soviet military launches an offensive because they are desperate to break out or at least try to open some supply lines to Leningrad. And so by their own admission, bolstered both inside and outside the city by an incredibly emotional performance of Shostakovich's Symphony 7, the Soviets launched an offensive and they massively concentrated their forces. I believe they debuted tanks in this particular theater for the very first time in August and September 1942. And they aim not for the Finns and not for the Germans so much as the Spanish Blue Division. Yeah, those fucking asshole volunteers who've marched their asses all the way through Europe to help the Germans surround Leningrad. And it would make a great story if I could tell you that the Soviet tanks, after days of fighting and finally broke those bastard Spanish fascists and opened up a supply line to Leningrad and then got the city resupplied, the population recovered, and then beat the Germans back. But that isn't what happened.
Yeah.
It's probably not their fault because what they didn't know is that at the same time they were planning on doing this, the Germans were actually planning their own breakthrough and were going to try to finish off the city at the same time. And so, like, from the Soviet point of view, they launched this huge offensive and it's just barely doesn't win, which makes it's very costly and everyone feels like a failure. But what they don't know is that because they launched that offensive, they probably saved the city from destruction because the Germans were about to do the same shit to them. And if they had broken through, they were going to just, like we said, roll up the whole thing, literally level every building and then feudalize the land over time. And in turn, instead, neither side really gets what they wanted. But as a sort of war cry, Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, it fails. The Soviets don't win. The art does not inspire them to victory, and the siege will go on for many more, hundreds of more days.
Yeah, it goes until like January or February.
I could look it up, but we wasn't even going to get to their relief today. Sorry, Leningrad. Yeah. But just to say, like, their relief is coming, but it won't be at the hands of or in the days and the heady days after Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony is played.
Yeah.
And when I read that, it made me really sad because like I said before, not that the Soviets were all roses and beauty, but I will admit to having picked a side in this fight that I'm describing here, and it's the Soviets. I want them to win, please. Fuck, fuck those fascists.
Yeah.
But it
not to telegraph our.
Sorry to get political on this podcast, but I don't want to scare anyone because we're not about to talk about God and whether God exists, but I read something on Marxist.org in one of the articles. I don't even remember when, and it wasn't about God. But it went something like this. A decent Marxist shouldn't really ask, should I believe in God? Should people believe in God? Because are they real or not? But the better question is to ask, why do people believe in God? Why do they come to believe in God? And in that spirit, it might not be a useful question to ask. Should they have bothered with all this? Should they have literally killed 3 musicians from exhaustion to put this show on? Should they have launched a 3,000 shell barrage of German artillery positions to silence them during the performance. Was all this worth it? Is not really maybe a question, although it's one that I wanted to ask. But maybe the question is, why do people do this? Especially when it turns out that Shostakovich's Symphony Number 7 didn't beat the Germans for them. And I don't really know why people do this. Why do you think people do this, Tim's? Maybe that's too hard. That's a tough
No,
question.
it's I've been thinking about this for a while actually. Have you ever seen the movie Enemy at the Gates?
I have not. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's not that good of a movie. You're not really missing all that much. It's about the Battle of Stalingrad, and it's particularly about the like sub battle between snipers on both sides during the battle. But
Okay.
what I like about the movie is that Bob Hoskins he plays Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev
Hell yeah.
he was like the senior political commissar at Stalingrad during the Battle of Stalingrad. There's this scene where the Red Army has its backs up against the wall, and Khrushchev calls all of the other political commissars. Like every Red Army unit has a political commissar in it. Calls them all together and says, like, what are we going to do? Like, we can't let Stalingrad fall because it symbolizes the boss, and we have to hold the line here. Everybody's making suggestions. We should shoot every 10th man. We should support the families of men that desert. And all these other suggestions. And then one of the protagonists in the movie is played by Joseph Fiennes. He says, "Give them hope. You have to give them a belief that it's not all lost. You have to give them something to think that they're still fighting for, and that's maybe what will get them over the finish line." And I couldn't help but connect that idea to what they were trying to do in Leningrad, to have the people understand that they hadn't been given up on, that there was still hope that they were going to be able to get out of it. And that's an important part of of any war effort, really. I mean, there has to be morale. I mean, even in the worst of conditions, if people are going to survive, there has to be a sense that that there's a possibility of it ending favorably for them.
I love that answer. And not just because I like it generally, but it also like leads me to like some of the things that I was thinking about. Not to get like too heady again into like a philosophy of art, musicology, or anything like that. But it strikes me as one way to look at the symphony as I described it as like a message, from somebody to somebody. That's kind of what art is, designed to evoke a response. But it's also like a sort of positive thing. It's not positive in the sense of like good, but positive in the sense that it's extant. So like the performance becomes a thing. The music becomes a vision, a positive one. It's not just the removal of something, but the addition to the universe of something at a very basic and fundamental level. And this, even though it's wordless, is very important to people, not just in their lives and in war, uh, but in politics too. And even, I dare say, and here I go off the deep end. even perhaps in podcasting, an author is a sort of artist, I think we all admit, and I write every word either in my head or on a page before I say it.
Some of your guests even read them.
Yeah, some of them. And my point there is just to say that, like, a lot of what I see that is made these days on the political left media and in media generally is simply like it is a positive, I guess, in the sense that like a video exists that didn't before, but the content is all negative. Not negative in the sense that they're think a thing is bad and they get mad, although sometimes it is that, but it is just commentary upon something. Often it's commentary upon commentary, which is itself commentary upon something else. And there doesn't ever seem to be anything to talk about that is positive in that way, and everyone would rather talk about what others are talking about. And I am not good at that, so I don't like it. Because I don't like things that I'm not good at, because I'm childish. And maybe that's true, but also I think that for me it's important, at least sometimes, especially these days, for everyone, when it can be difficult to find something meaningful to do, to speak, or to create, to
Yeah.
not do that stuff all the time, and to speak into existence even when things are hopeless or seem to be, a positive creation, and positive artistically. Man, maybe I don't know if any of that makes any sense to anybody at all. But it makes a lot of sense to me. And as stupid as this may sound, in that sense, like I feel a sort of kinship with Shostakovich and with the Leningrad Radio Orchestra. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because the answer is like, why make art at all when things are bad? Hell, why make it when things are good? Everything's already been said or will be said by somebody else. Why even bother? In the face of death. And death's always there, whether or not you're sieged in Leningrad or not. Because I got news for you: if you're listening to this, you're gonna die. Sorry, it's gonna happen one day. So why bother? And the only real reason is because we think we should. And to think you should is as the kids say today, Andrew, that's cringe, bro. you're a fucking tryhard, man. Why are you such a tryhard? I think it's worth doing, and it's worth them doing at some level, and it's worth Shostakovich writing essentially, and it's worth them playing. And I think that's cool.
So do I.